Hi, my name is Ira Gardner. Welcome to my studio. I'm going to be doing a series of video tutorials on portraiture for the Photo 232 portraiture class at Spokane Falls Community College. To begin with, we're going to start out with a basic head and shoulders studio portrait. In the studio we have control over all the lighting, and today we're going to focus on 5 basic patterns or lighting styles as we call them, and go over all the fundamentals of portraiture. So to begin with, I want to describe our studio situation and some of the decisions I've made for today. The first thing is, you'll notice I've got a simple white sweep for the backdrop, and the only reason I'm doing that today is to give us good separation between the subject's head and the background, because I'm only going to use one light for the first demonstration, because I want you to see how the shadows and the highlights fall in the face. It is the shadows that define the three-dimensional quality of any photograph. So for simplicity's sake, to start with the building blocks, we're going to use one light. So in that case, I chose a white background so you can kind of see the outline of the body and not have any shadows merging into the backdrop. However, I want to demonstrate something really critical in basic studio portraiture, and that has to do with the subject to background distance. In studio lighting, there's 2 main things that we're going for when it comes to our lighting. The first decision we need to make is we want the lighting to look natural, meaning that natural lighting is when we have a single dominant light source that's mirroring or mimicking the sunlight in the sky. We only have one sun in our sky. We are used to biologically of walking around the earth with a single light source, and so we want to have one dominant light source, which is going to be our main light. The other thing about our lighting is that we want the angle of that light to be about 35 to 45 degrees, because if the light falls too low, it's kind of like doing a flashlight with spooky lighting. And the reason that we do that around a campfire is because it's so unnatural, because we don't see our sun below us, we see it above us. But the other thing that is very, very critical in a studio environment is I want to be able to illuminate every factor in our portrait independently. So the reason I want to be able to do that is so that I can control everything about my composition in the camera. So I want to light my background separate from my subject, and in order to have total control over that, what I'm going to show you today is the fact that if I set the stool where the subject's going to be sitting at least 5 feet away, okay, I'm at 5 feet, the fall off from the subject to the background, from the main light or even the fill light, when we eventually add a second light, will be so significant that that background will go almost black. So even though I'm using a white seamless sweep, I've got the ability to make it a really dark value, almost black, so that I can then illuminate the background to any color or any tonality that I want, independent from my key light or my main light on the subject. So when we're working in the studio, we have one primary goal in mind when it comes to lighting, and that is to keep our light looking as natural as possible. What I mean by that is we have, biologically, we are hardwired as human beings to expect to have a single light source in the sky. We have one sun in our solar system, and you'll notice that the sun is always above the horizon. So generally we start out with a dominant main light that's angled up at about 35 to 45 degree angle. And the reason we do this is because that's the way we expect to see the world. So compared to having a natural light above the horizon line, when we sit around the campfire and hold a flashlight under our face, it looks extra scary. And the reason that the lighting looks scary is because it's so unnatural. It doesn't look the way we expect it to, and so we get a little more frightened. It makes for great campfire stories. So an easy way to remember how to control your background illumination independently from your main light is to think about the inverse square law. And what that means is basically every time I double the distance between my subject and my light source, I'm losing 2 stops of intensity of light. So think of it this way. Theoretically, if I had a single candle that was illuminating a 4-inch by 5-inch area, and I doubled the distance, I would be illuminating twice each of those dimensions. So I would have an 8 by 10 area. Well, that same light source is now spread out over 4 times the area. Well, in photographic terms, we understand that to be the equivalent of 2 f-stops. So if I were to have a subject to main light distance of 3 feet, and I've got a distance to my background of 6 feet, I've got 2 stops fall off, which means that the background is going to be 2 stops darker than my subject. Now, if I extended that a little bit further, I can even make this white seamless backdrop become pure black. The goal here of having a significant distance is a couple of factors. Number one, we want to be able to control the illumination of the background independent from our main light, so we can change its color, we can change its brightness, we have a lot of compositional control. The second thing that we want to be able to do is to control our shadows, because if I have a subject right up next to the background, I will see dark shadows on my background. What I want is enough distance between the subject and the background to where those shadows fall out of the camera's viewpoint. The other thing is when we start adding a second light and we have a fill light, that fill light is illuminating the whole set. Well, I want the shadow from my subject to fall down on the floor out of sight of the camera. And we'll talk more about that when we get into our background tutorial and when we start adding additional lighting for our basic headshot. So for today's lesson, we're going to focus just primarily on lighting styles, but I just want to make sure you understand that we want our subject at least 5 feet from the background, maybe even 7. One of the other factors you have to consider when you have subject to background distance is the further the subject is from the background, the more the angle of view, and you start to see the limits of the background. So if I needed to have 10 feet, I'm going to have a 12 to 15 foot background to be able to frame that and not see the outer edges. So with this, we have a 9-foot seamless background, I have a 5-foot distance, and it's very easy for me to compose the frame so that I don't see the edges of the background. Okay? So kind of a general guideline, whatever the distance out from the background, I generally want a backdrop that's twice as wide. Now we have a lot more control over head and shoulder because I'm cropping in fairly tight, but if I were doing full length, this becomes a real issue. Another basic guideline for studio portrait that I want to point out here is very, very important, is everything that you don't see in the camera in the portrait affects what you do see. And what I mean by that is I want you to notice that the stool I'm using allows the model to put 1 foot up and 1 foot down. And what that's going to allow the model to do is create asymmetrical balance, because they're going to have a shoulder that's slightly angled, slightly sloped. The worst thing we can do most of the time, rules are always made to be broken, but for the most part when it comes to posing a head and shoulders portrait is we want to create diagonals because they're more dynamic. They create more energy or movement within the frame. Whereas if I have shoulders straight side to side, I have horizontal and I have vertical lines which are very static compositionally. So I just want to point out that we want to set up the body that's not in the frame in an asymmetrical way, and one of the ways we can do that is using a stool that allows the person to put their foot up, or if we're using a stool that doesn't have that, get a little step stool that we can put one of the legs up to create that asymmetry. I want you to go ahead and just pull one arm back. Yep, there we go, good. Drop, relax your shoulder, there we go. And I want you to just notice how the shoulders have a little more of an angle. Now just kind of tilt your head a little bit this way. There we go, good. And it's a little more dynamic. So before we really get into studio headshot portrait, there are 3 factors that I think are very critical to every portrait we make. The first one being the light style and quality. It's the lighting. The second is going to be the posing, and the third ultimately is the expression. Now when it comes to lighting styles and when it comes to posing, there is, and even to some degree when it comes to expression, there is a lot of redundancy. The magic of being a portrait photographer is not in the infinite variety of lighting styles, because what we're going to talk about is 5 basic lighting styles that I think accomplish everything we could possibly hope to accomplish in most of our portraiture. There's always room to break the rules, but to begin with we have to know what they are, and I will tell you that there's 5 basic lighting styles that create virtually an infinite variety of images. There are only so many basic poses, and you're going to be doing some research on posing. And frankly, when it comes to expression, there's basically your extreme euphoria, big smile, which moms love. It's the roadmap of a grin from ear to ear. There's the pensive mood, and then there can be anger sort of gradation. So you have a spectrum from anger to extreme joy, and again, we see that over and over in our lifetime. So how do I become excited about being a portraiture when I start to feel limitations of basic poses, basic lighting, basic expression? The magic of portrait photography is in the relationship to the subject between the photographer and the person that's modeling for you. The magic is the exchange, the infinite variety of experiences of relating with a person one-on-one or relating with a group of people in the case of a group portrait. I can't emphasize that enough. The most difficult thing, everybody thinks portraiture is really easy because the lighting's basically pretty standardized. But when you start photographing something that is talking back to you, when you're photographing somebody that is waiting for you to get the lights set up, waiting for you to take the meter readings, waiting for you to compose the subject, you realize all of a sudden it's like being a juggler with a whole lot of balls up in the air simultaneously that you're trying to keep track of. And oftentimes you miss the magic moment of the expression. It is through the drawing out of that human being, that spirit, is what we're trying to accomplish in every portrait we make. And in fact, the fact of the matter is everybody with a cell phone is a photographer, and they all make snapshots. Our goal as professional photographers is to make something that penetrates the spirit more deeply, that is timeless, that draws upon what it means to be a human being. And to do that, I can't be thinking about the technical aspect. I can't emphasize this enough. There's a great book that I highly recommend everybody reads called Zen and the Art of Archery. It was written by Eugen Herrigel in, I believe, 1958, where he discusses the mastery of archery comes from when you can let go of consciously thinking about it, that you have done it over and over and over to where you've mastered the technique that you no longer think about it. I would like to suggest that today's lesson on lighting style is the beginning steps towards mastery, to where you will be doing these lighting styles over and over and over and over to where you can finally forget about it and just have a relationship with your model. Okay, so a couple things I want to talk about before we begin is the kind of light that I'm using today. I'm going to use a single light source, and in this case I'm using a fairly hard edge light source. I'm using a parabolic reflector with a grid on it, a honeycomb grid. You can see that. In addition to that, I have some ways of controlling the light source with barn doors to keep it from falling off onto the background. I can control my background light even more. So not only do I have the inverse square law working for me in terms of my subject to background distance, but I also have barn doors that are keeping it from contaminating. Now, I will tell you that this is not typical professional studio portraiture in this day and age. More photographers are using umbrellas, shoot-through umbrellas, and soft boxes, and I will go over working with those. Working with those light modifiers in future lessons. But today I want to get back to basics because you need to be able to see a hard shadow line in order to really understand what your light style looks like. Not to mention, I think it has kind of a re-emerging retro style that seems appropriate as a way to differentiate. The reason most people are using soft boxes is because they're emulating soft window light portraiture, which virtually everybody looks good, but again, it requires a lot more finesse and control to do this sort of lighting in the studio. So for today, you can use either a parabolic reflector, or you could use just the basic 7-inch reflector on a typical white lightning studio light as well, because it's going to allow you to see these hard shadow lines, okay? And that's the goal for today. We want to be able to see the different light styles that we're working with, which are defined by the shadow on the face. So to begin with, we really want to make sure we have our light at the right height. And I want to point something out. If you, Ian, will stand up. I want you to notice that if I stand my subject up, and I'll turn the light towards him, if I were to make a photo right now, the catch light in the eye is going to be about 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock, depending on which side of the face the light's on. So I would need to raise this light source up even further because I want to have the specular highlights in the eye to show up at about 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Go ahead and have a seat. So I'm going to set this light at a height for him that if I were to draw a string, it would come down at an angle between 35 and 45 degrees. What that's going to do is that's going to put the catch light, the specular highlight in the eye, which without that specular highlight, the portrait is lifeless. It really is the sparkle of life is the catch lights. I'm going to put this 35 to 45 degree, and the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to angle that light so that when I come in here, I'll bring this in real close so you can see it for the video purposes with the modeling light. The other factor that I want to control, you'll notice when I get too low, I want you to pay attention to the shadow on the bridge of the nose. There's a couple things we got to watch out for. We want to not have the shadow come into the eye socket, okay? And we don't want the shadow, so if I have the light too low, not only does it start looking unnatural, let's bring it all the way down, but it also creates the shadow of the bridge of the nose goes into the eye. Now what we want is we want to raise this light up, like I said, 35, 45 degree angle. And zoom in really close on the face here for this. Okay. Turn your head towards the light a little bit more. Nope, this way. Yep, look, come back, come back, back. Right, look, come back, right there, right there. Okay. So what I want to point out is this actually is a light style that I don't use anymore, but you will see it in classic literature, and that's called loop lighting. Don't ask me why they call it loop lighting, other than the fact that we want to watch out that the nose shadow is coming off of the nose at about a 45 degree angle. It allows light to still get into his eye socket if I adjust it a little bit. And in this case, it's loop lighting when the nose shadow does not connect to the jawbone shadow. So you have a shadow that's visible from the nose because, keep in mind, it is the shadows that create the illusion of three-dimensional form in any two-dimensional photograph. So the shadows are absolutely critical, not the highlights. We want to control the highlights to be able to see texture in the skin, but in terms of defining three-dimensionality, it's all about the shadows. Well, if the nose shadow starts to come down into the mouth, the top of the lip, it starts looking unattractive. And again, if we bring it too high, the shadow goes into the mouth itself and it destroys the portrait, plus we don't have the catch lights as well. So this is, again, it's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We don't want the light too high, we don't want it too low, we want it just right so that we get a loop shadow of about 45 degrees. And again, I point out that if you're using a softbox or an umbrella, you still need to understand these rules and follow them, because it's very easy to make mistakes and not see it until afterwards. Let me emphasize something right here and now, okay? When you're using more contemporary lighting tools such as a softbox or an umbrella where you've got this kind of soft shadow edge transition, it's just as important to follow these rules and guidelines for proper lighting as it is if I'm using the hard edge lighting of a parabolic reflector. The reason being is it's easy to make mistakes and not see them right away. And in fact, if I'm doing commercial advertising, you'll notice fashion photography and commercial advertising photography break some of these rules all the time. It can look almost sloppy, if you will. Well, if I'm putting it on a billboard that traffic's driving by at 25 to 35 miles an hour, they don't have time to see the imperfections. Okay? I see them because I'm trained to see them, but the average consumer doesn't. If I'm doing a video presentation, I'm moving from one image to another, I can get away, cinematographers can get away with some of these mistakes a little bit more, although the good ones don't, and certainly the higher the price of production, the more attention to detail there is, absolutely. But when I'm making a portrait that's going to be on somebody's wall, going to be in a coffee table book, going to be on a Facebook wall where everybody's going to see it and it's going to be there for an extended period of time, the still photo brings about or causes us to scrutinize it over time. And I will tell you, in my 25 years of, more than 25 years of professional experience, I had an interesting story where, as a matter of practice, every time I delivered a portrait to a client, I waited 2 weeks and then I sent them a letter thanking them for their purchase and inviting them to bring back, or if there was anything that was unsatisfactory, please bring it back and let us take care of it before we'll replace it. Now, most time, never had that happen, but I remember one particular case where a client came in with their framed 16 by 20 portrait saying, you know, and they had the letter with them. So they walk in with the letter, the portrait said, Ira, thank you very much for this letter, it means a lot to us. We don't know what it is that we weren't happy with, but when we sat it on the wall and lived with it for a week, it just wasn't right. And in that particular case, it was Christmas time, everything was rushed, and you know what, the quality wasn't quite what it should have been. And so we remade that, and we kept that customer because of it. So you have to pay attention to detail. The silver lining on that particular story is if I hadn't sent the letter, they would have lived with it because it was professional quality, but they probably never would have come back, and they probably would have told 10 to 20 of their friends not to come here either. As a result of sending that letter and inviting scrutiny, inviting questions, and standing behind the work, I ended up photographing 2 other members of that family and getting a lot of references from it. So I can't stress how important it is. If you're going to make a living as a photographer, you better become a perfectionist now. And it starts right here with Lighting Styles 101 in our first lesson. Okay, a couple of things before we get too far down the road. Since this is our first lesson, I want to point something out that's very important. You know, the Bible has a parable about the prophet's not without honor save in his own town, or the other axiom that we have in our culture is this idea of familiarity breeds contempt. I want to encourage you as photographers to find models that you don't know very well. They will actually cooperate better in front of the camera than your friends and family will. There is a familiarity that creates, let's put it this way, whenever I go down the street or you go down the street and you see somebody, we typically will do one of 2 things. We'll either say, how's it going? And we aren't really waiting around for the answer, but what we're actually doing is we're acknowledging the other person. And because we don't know them, we want to present ourselves in a favorable light, so we act concerned. We say, hey, how you doing? Or we can walk down and simply do the head tilt or the nod, the acknowledgement gesture. Or what I like to call it is, it's the driving down the country road and it's the little wave. You know, you're driving down, car comes by, you wave. Every time you meet a new person, in communication theory we talk about it being a face-threatening act, because every human being wants to be acknowledged. Well, when I photograph somebody that doesn't know me and I don't know them extremely well, what happens is there is a natural disposition to want to please the other person. So I can get them to tilt their head, to turn their head by just doing hand gestures, and they will be very pliable to whatever it is I need them to do. Now, I try to photograph my teenage son, and it can be some of the most difficult experiences because you're like, Dad, I don't want to do this, right? People are uncomfortable in front of the camera. That's why most of us photographers like to be behind the camera. I think it's a really important part of this class that you each take turns being a model and understand the experience from the model's perspective of what it feels like to be photographed, and then also recognize how important it is for that collaboration, cooperation, whatever you want to call that, into making an important portrait. Now, the other extreme is where you know somebody so intimately that you have something you actually want to say about them through your portrait. In that case, again, you established a deep personal relationship that you can go further with in your portraiture, and those are some of the most privileged images I've made. I work with somebody that I don't know very well, or I want to work with somebody that I have some really important message I'm trying to get across. I know them so deeply and personally, and they will just give themselves to me to make a meaningful portrait. Some of the other issues we want to talk about is, in terms of extremes, is depth of field, sharpness. I either want extreme sharpness or I want extreme shallow depth of field, because in between is no man's land. It's just not an interesting image. So typically in a studio headshot portrait, I want the background to go soft focus. So I'm typically photographing f5.6. If it's a single person, I might even drop down to f4. If I have multiple people, I'll shoot at f8, f11 to get more depth of field for heads to be in focus. It's very, very critical that we have what we call the mask of the face. And in fact, when we talk about lighting, we're really focused on from the hairline to the chin is called the mask of the face. And we want to make sure that's in critical sharp focus. Most important point of focus is going to be the eyes. With portraiture, we are trying to, with commercial portraiture in particular, one of the things that makes it commercial is the fact that we're trying to show people in a flattering or pleasing light. There's some general guidelines to pay attention to with light style and how to choose the right light style for the face of the person we're photographing. There are two universal design principles that come into play. The first universal design principle is this idea of what's called most average face. And what that really means is we want to create the feeling of a nice golden mean oval on what we call the mask of the face. It comes from the hairline to the chin. So if people come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, we have round faces, we have narrow faces, we're going to pick the light style that's going to create the most average oval golden mean face. The other issue that I want to address, universal design principles, has to do with what's called the faceism ratio. The tighter the headshot, the more cerebral the image appears to be. Meaning that the tighter the headshot, the more we see the person and think about what they're thinking than what they look like. And so we can get this really contemplative, thoughtful. The wider the shot, the more physical body that we show, the more sensual the image becomes, the more sexualized it becomes. So I want you to start paying attention to that as you research. So to begin with, when I'm setting up my portrait, I typically start with, again, this idea of opposites. I typically start with the body turned away from the main light source and the head turned back towards the light source. What this does is it gives excellent texture to the fabric of the clothing while giving great illumination to the face, and it creates this convergence, this diagonal line of the body's one way, the head's the other. creates a little more energy. Now, where I don't do this is if I'm doing an executive portrait where somebody's wearing a white or light blue shirt and a tie, I want to be not showing any of those wrinkles. In that case, I'll turn the body towards the light source to fill in those shadows on the texture. But those are your typical real estate headshots, professional portraits that you would see in a newspaper, and that's a whole nother discussion. But to begin with, I generally, to make more interesting portraits, turn the body away from the light source, and from this position, we have three basic light styles that we can do. When I have the light on one side of the face, I can create three distinct light styles without moving the light source, or at least without making too many adjustments. The first lighting style that I'm going to talk about is where I have the subject turn towards the light. Keep turning, keep turning. There we go. And what this is this is called short lighting. The reason it's called short lighting is because the highlight area is away from the camera and the shadow side is towards the camera, and it creates the illusion of narrowing the size of the face. If I turn the head away from the light source, go ahead and turn your head right there, good. You'll notice the highlight side of the face is towards the camera and the shadow side is away, and the shadows start to appear narrower and the highlights appear broader. We call this broad lighting. This is useful when photographing somebody with a narrow face where we want to give it more roundness to it. The third light style with very little modification is going to be where the subject turns somewhere in between. Keep to your right there, keep coming right there. Now, what I have going on here is called split lighting, and I want you to just stare for just a moment and I want to turn your head just slightly to the right. Just come back, right there. Keep coming, right there. I want you to pay attention, because this is a little detail that you won't see much in commercial photography where split lighting is very popular. But what I'm doing is I'm getting a light into both eyes. To me, that's my piece de resistance. The most important quality of every portrait is I want light illuminating both eyes. But what I have here is a 50-50 split. We call it split lighting. The next lighting style actually can be done with either short or broad lighting, and for illustration purposes I'm going to start out by doing it with the short lighting, and this is called Rembrandt lighting. And what this is, I'm going to adjust the light just a little bit, and you'll watch the shadow connect to the side of the face. So instead of loop lighting, looking right up here, right there, good, you will see a small patch of light that is connected, the shadow's connected from the nose to the jawline, and we call that Rembrandt lighting, made famous by the painter, right? Now, I can do that, actually I can do that with split lighting, with a straight on, symmetrical composition where we see both ears. I can have them turn the head towards the light more, and I can adjust my light a little bit more, and I can have a Rembrandt with short lighting, or I can have you turn your head away, and I can bring the light out here, come back this way just slightly, right there. And I would have a Rembrandt lighting with broad lighting. So I categorized Rembrandt lighting as our fourth lighting style that can be applied to all three of short, broad, split lighting. The final lighting style that is used primarily in fashion and in modeling and made really, really famous by the early Hollywood photographers in the heyday of Hollywood in the 40s, made famous by George Hurrell, is that of butterfly lighting. With butterfly lighting, I'm raising the light source above. Now, I'm not doing a very nice job of it right now, and we'll talk more about how to do proper butterfly. You really need two lights to do it well. But just to see what the butterfly is turn your head towards the light source, keep turning, keep turning. I want you to pay attention to the nose shadow. I want the nose shadow to be symmetrical and falling down below the nose. But the trick with the butterfly is to have the shadow between the top of the lip and the base of the nose, about halfway. I can control, based on the height and direction, that butterfly light. Now what this does is it typically creates these nice shadows on the cheeks. It creates kind of a V lighting style, and this is probably the most popular glamour lighting technique still in use today. What I want to talk about right now is two other factors that we need to pay attention to. One factor is we need to pay attention to the color line of the person's shirt, because what happens is we generally want to crop just below the neckline of the person's shirt. Let's have you look right here. Good, just a hint of a smile, a little bit more right there. Close your mouth all the way. Just there you go, a little more of a smile, a little more right there. Good. Okay, now just stay right there, and I'm going to zoom in and make another couple of compositions progressively zoomed in. If I don't see the bottom of the neckline, humans naturally perceive that as those lines never touch. Maybe it's Euclidean geometry that says parallel lines never intersect, but what happens, and if you start paying attention to this, anytime you don't see a neckline come together, there's the assumption of nudity. And this becomes very seductive in advertising. And I don't want to be stereotypical and focus on the female figure when it comes to sexuality, because we are well aware that sexuality is applied towards both sexes. So the point I want to make is pay attention to the neckline and know that if I'm cropping it out, I'm being very sexually suggestive because the mind fills in and says, oh, there's nothing underneath there. The thing I want to mention about light is we have to decide which side of the person to put the light on. Now, if there's a scar on one side and they want to hide it, that kind of answers it for it. But a general guideline is I don't want to shoot into the part of the hair. So if the part is going this way, I generally put the light on the side of the part, so that the most common lighting style I use is short lighting, so when his head's turned towards the light, I'm looking at the hair. If I were doing broad light, I would move the light to the other side so that when he turns away from the light, I'm looking at the nice flowing side of the hair. Now when people pull their hair straight back or they have it split in the middle, it doesn't really matter which side the light is. But in general, when somebody has a strong part to one side, I'm going to put the main light on whatever side is going to show the flowing side, not shooting into the part of the head. So now I want to pay attention. Right now I am really tight. I'm not composing a portrait right now other than to say, okay, oh, eyes open right here. All right, so what I'm paying attention to is I have both ears showing. Now I'm going to have the subject turn your head towards the light, keep turning, no, the other way, oh, come back, right there. I'm going to take that composition. People do this all the time. Turn a little bit more, oh, come back, right, oh, go back, right there, boom, and go a little bit further, boom, right there. And look, one more right there, good. Okay, now, what I'm doing right now is I am focusing on what's known as a 2/3 view of the face. And what that means is I am turning the head just until I lose the ear. Because as you'll see, if I see just a little bit of an ear sticking out, and everybody have different size ears, when you start doing portraiture, you'll realize that nothing is really symmetrical. Ears are at different height, eyes are at different height, eyes are at different sizes. But the big thing now with the 2/3 view of the face is I'm turning the head just to the point where I lose the ear. Now if I turn it too far, keep going, this is going to sound a little disgusting, but if I turn it too far, keep turning, right there. What happens is the subject looks like their eyeball is going to fall out of its eye socket because there's nothing holding, there's no skin holding that eye into place, okay? So I want you to be aware of, and I'll just tell you a story that sometimes doing a critique when you've put a lot of effort and had a really special bond with the person you're photographing can be very, very difficult. And I remember one time I photographed a young lady who frankly I was crazy about. And a portrait was an opportunity to really build that relationship. And I think many photographers, that opportunity to interact, it becomes that powerful tool for connection, right? So I had made a series of portraits that were going to be used as Christmas gifts, and this was back in the days of shooting with a 4x5 black and white film-based camera. Had to develop it myself, print it in the darkroom. I made this 16 by 20 print, and the young lady is leaning on her hand, and I had her turned in such a way that the first thing the instructor said is, "Oh, she's lost her hand. It looks like a stump." Now, I will tell you that my heart sunk, and I was upset. I felt terrible about it, but he was absolutely right. We need to pay attention to and be absolutely critical of our work, to where I needed to show, if I'm going to have a hand, I need to show the profile as opposed to showing the flat of the hand. But I also need to make sure I'm not hiding the hand to where it starts, if I start doing this, this becomes, it's not an arm, it's a stump. Or we need to pay attention to what things really look like, not what they actually are, right? We need to get into the photographic dimension of seeing line, shape, form, texture, and not paying attention to what we assume is, oh, well, that's their arm. Well, yeah, it's not. For portrait on a two-dimensional image, it becomes a stump. So when I start talking about ear nubbins sticking out or eyeballs falling out of a socket, it's not to make fun or to make you feel bad. It's to help you remember, oh yeah, don't want the nubbins. Oh yeah, don't want to let the eyeballs fall out. It's a way to engage you in this idea of how can I remember those fine details. Hopefully after today's lesson and you start applying these lighting styles to your work, you're going to realize that metaphor of juggler is really appropriate, because all the fine details, because human beings move. I'm not photographing a tabletop still life. I'm photographing a living, breathing thing. And they have twitches, and in fact, the human face has about 20 facial muscles that are always in motion when we're conscious. So I'm having to work and capture that magic click when the head's turned just right, when the expression's just right. I generally want to catch an expression while it's on the way up or when it's on the way down. We generally don't want the, first of all, people that smile really big, they squint. How am I going to deal with that, right? So I want to get a soft expression, right? Ian, come back in here for a moment, and let's just kind of discuss that a little bit more.
Or how do you?
Yep, you go ahead and have a seat. Just get comfortable. Okay. When it comes to posing, and even on the simplest head and shoulders portrait, I want to let the subject find their natural equilibrium, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to augment or adjust it to make a really good photograph. So oftentimes in portraiture, I have to do something where I'm twisting or turning slightly beyond what's comfortable, but it actually is to make it look right in two-dimensionality. I want to point out that actually when you see a supermodel on the street, you'll be very surprised. Oftentimes they will have exaggerated features. They'll have big chins or bigger noses. And they're supermodels because those exaggerated three-dimensional features don't flatten out as much in two-dimensional photographs as the average face does. So when people have perfect proportions in person, they can tend to be very flat in the two-dimensional photograph. So we have to do a few things to enhance the look and feel of a three-dimensional person in a two-dimensional portrait. Part of that's going to be through lighting and shadowing, part of that's going to be through posing and maybe turning the head beyond a certain point or back a certain point. I have to pay attention to all those little details. Okay, some other basic important ingredients to portraiture in the studio or anywhere else has to do with lens selection, focal length of the lens, and the camera angle itself. Now, I still like to have a camera stand or a tripod, even though when I'm working with a digital SLR or 35mm type camera where I can do handheld, typically I will shoot a lot handheld in the studio, but I always want that camera stand for setting things up, being able to work on the light, work with the subject, maybe adjust the clothing. By the way, never touch the model without asking permission. May I adjust your shirt, please?
Yes.
Okay, and tell them as you're making adjustments, tell them what you're doing and why you're doing it. But let's talk back to the camera, a couple little details here. Number one, we typically want to use a slight telephoto lens. We want to do this for a couple of reasons. Everything I teach seems to be like Noah's Ark, that everything comes in twos, right? So we want a slight telephoto lens. One reason we want a slight telephoto is people get uncomfortable. It's called it's kind of like the elevator effect. You notice when you walk into a crowded elevator, people don't look at each other. They get uncomfortable. You're in my bubble, my personal space. So I don't want to have a short lens that causes me to be too close. I don't want too long a lens that causes me to be across the football field yelling, trying to interact with my subject either. So with a typical, and I'm using terms relative to 35 millimeter, we're working with a full frame 35 millimeter sensor on an EOS 5D. On a full frame, I like to shoot 85 to 120 millimeter range. 70 is a bare minimum, but generally I like 85 to 120, 135 millimeter. When I get much beyond 150, I'm too far away, and I also have a flattening out long lenses compressed. So I don't want to compress too much, but I want to have eliminate the other factor, which is the second factor is I want to eliminate any effect of foreshortening. If I use a short focal length lens too close to the subject, it will cause their arms to look like Popeye, huge arms and a small head. It throws the perspective out, it distorts the perspective. So I want a slight telephoto that allows me to keep the face and the body relatively same proportion. We really want to focus on the mask of the face, and even if I'm photographing with hands, I want the light on the face to be slightly lighter or brighter than on any hands. That's where the attention needs to be drawn to. And we'll talk more about that when we get into posing. The second factor I want you to pay attention to, and why I'm using the camera stand to illustrate this, is camera angle or camera height relative to the subject. I generally want to shoot at a slight downward angle. And the reason I want to do this, again, there's two reasons. The first reason is if I get too low, I'm photographing the Adam's apple. Now I will tell you, and again, women are particularly sensitive to wrinkles. And it is the eyes, what we call the crow's feet around the eyes, and it is the neck that generally will show wrinkles first, and Adam's apples aren't particularly attractive. So by raising that camera angle up, I can get a strong jaw. In fact, I'm going to have you lean forward just a little bit. I can get a strong jawline and a shadow that's going to hide the neck. Okay, so I'm changing the angle of view, I'm also getting some shadows in there, and I'm emphasizing the strong jaw while de-emphasizing the throat area. If I get my angle too low, I'm going to emphasize that throat area, and it's not particularly attractive on men. It can be quite unattractive to look at the Adam's apple. The other factor is I get in the habit of shooting at a slight elevated angle, because if I'm photographing two people, well, now depth of field, if I'm down low, is really difficult when the distance is emphasized this way. But if I change the angle, I change my plane of focus where I can pull person behind and in front into the same plane of focus by shooting and tilting that camera. So I need to raise it up, tilt it slightly, and I will get more depth of field to pull a group of people into sharp focus. General rule, the more people in the frame, the more cells I will have. Okay, so while I'm photographing and starting with a single individual, I guarantee you that if I was doing an engagement session with two people, I will sell more images than I will of the individual, unless they're rich and famous, Hollywood star, and everybody wants it. If I'm doing a family group, every one of those people in that family are going to want those images. The more people in front of the camera, the more sales potential I have. So therefore I need to pay attention to my depth of field and my sharpness, because nobody wants an out of focus blurry image.